Hey everybody, I'm Seth with Stuff Seth Makes, and in this video, I'm bringing new life to this old Singer sewing machine cabinet. I used some reclaimed oak to recreate some of the original parts from scratch, and I added a couple of custom details that I think you guys are really gonna like. So stick around and you can see how it all came together. Bringing this sewing machine table into the shop and having the chance to really check it out, it's definitely cool. It's got all these cool heavy cast iron parts, and you can tell that when it was originally made, it was made well. I have seen a lot of these over the years at antique stores, and even though this isn't going to go back to being a functioning sewing machine, it was still cool to see how some of these moving parts worked. The wood parts of this sewing machine table, particularly the top, have definitely seen better days, and the top piece is warped and splitting, and there's parts where the original veneer has curled up and it's coming off, and the whole thing has a whole lot of varnish or shellac on it, and that's got some drips and runs in it. When I lift up the lid, you can see the sewing machine would sit in this spot and would somehow be mounted to this spring-loaded arm. When you want to put away the sewing machine, it would swing down and you'd close these couple of parts, and then the sewing machine would just hang out down here by where your knees would normally go. And now that I've had a chance to look it over, it's time to start taking it apart. I had a little difficulty removing the spring-loaded arm. The screws that attached it to the underside of the tabletop were kind of hard to get a good grip on because the spring part was in the way. I thought the wrench would get that bolt out. It didn't. Then I thought I could pull the end of the spring out. I couldn't. Then I remembered, well, this top is going in the trash anyway, so... Next, I removed the little flip-down drawer thing. I'm not sure if I'm going to replace this part or not, but you can watch the whole video and find out. Once that was off, I went to remove the whole top, but it didn't come off. Turns out there's these 4 little hook pieces on the bottom of the drawer frames, and those hooked around the cast iron legs. But once those were off, I could lift off the entire top piece, drawers and all. Now, with the top removed, I can pull out the drawers, flip it over, and back out a few screws. Then I'll just set these frames aside and say adios to that old top. A little further inspection of the drawer frames, and for the most part they were okay. But they did have a little bit of wiggle, probably just because the glue had come loose over the years, and one of the vertical pieces was actually broken in the middle. And again, just really heavily shellacked with some runs and drips all over the place. So rather than trying to sand these all down and get into the corners and all that, I decided that I'm just going to rebuild these frame assemblies from scratch. So let's head over to the wood bin and see what I've got. As it turned out, I still had a few pieces of oak left over from the cross I built for my church. These boards have a unique profile that I needed to get rid of, so I started by taking a few passes over the joiner. And doing this allows me to flatten any cupping, twisting, or any other inconsistencies on that side of the board. As you can see, I only needed to remove a little bit of material, but this gives me a flat enough surface on that side of the board, and now I can send it through the planer to flatten the opposite side. After a few passes, I can flip it over and further remove that curvy profile, and just keep on going until I get to the thickness that I want. With the faces flattened, I can come back to the joiner and run the boards along the fence, and running the board this way will get me a nice flat edge, and I only need to take a couple passes on these because all I want is a flat enough edge that I can run against my table saw fence, which I'll do in just a moment. Over at the table saw, I set my fence so my first pass will rip off the first of those wonky profiled edges. And once those are done, I can move the fence a little closer to the blade and then rip off the other profiled edge. Finally, after all that milling, I've gotten the boards down to usable pieces, and now I can start laying them out for what will be the new top on this desk. With a little help from Big Blue, I can go ahead and make some reference lines for the dominoes. Of course, you can use biscuits or dowels or even pocket holes if that's what you got, but there's nothing like a good workout for my right arm, so I'm going domino. And after a few minutes, I'm all mortised out and ready to glue up this panel. Before I get the glue flowing, I like to lay down some packaging tape on the clamps. That way any glue squeeze out doesn't muck up my clamps, and then it's easy to take off later. You may notice I'm using Titebond 3 for this glue up, and that's just because it's got a longer open time and it allows me a little more time to get my dominoes in place and to get plenty of glue coverage on the boards. Now I can set this aside and move on to the next part. In order to rebuild the framework for these drawers, I need to take some measurements to get the length and the width and the thickness of these different pieces. Then I can rip down some of the oak accordingly. The strips that will be the vertical pieces have a rounded over edge, so I replicate that over at the router table. And then I also cut them to length using my crosscut sled. Next, I rip down the wood for the horizontal parts, which will basically make up a rectangular frame. And these will be assembled using tongue and groove joinery, just like on the original. So I took out my regular blade, and then I loaded up my dado stack of blades, and as you can see from these cuts, that dado stack really gives you a nice square bottom slot. Then of course I cut those pieces to length over on my crosscut sled. I also cut to length the pieces that will have the tongues, and then of course I went ahead and cut the tongues that will fit into those grooves. I got all the tongue and groove stuff dialed in with some test pieces, and you don't need to watch me do all the testing, but what you can watch is this amazing slow motion footage of the dry fit. And since the dry fit fits so well, I think it's time to make it official. So now you can watch me glue all the parts together. Moving right along, and since I'd be sanding all the finish off these drawers anyway, I figured I'd cut the knobs off the drawers, and later on I'll pick up some new knobs that are in a similar style. To drill out the holes for the new hardware, I could have just used a regular drill, but for whatever reason I chose to make more work for myself. And to be honest, I think I just wanted to use the tilting table on my jet drill press. And I used my little digital angle gauge to get myself dialed in right to 90 degrees. I clamped the drawer down to the table and drilled my holes. Again, this was way more complicated than this step really needed to be, but I wanted to try it anyway. If you don't try it, you'll never know. As it turns out, the cap of an Arrowhead water bottle had the perfect radius for the corners of these frames, so I traced those and then chopped off some excess from the corners. I cut off the corners so there'd be less material to remove when I took them to the belt sander, which I do right now. On the original frames, the tongue and groove joints also had a metal pin inserted to help keep the joint together, and so I wanted to replicate this as well. I headed back to the drill press and drilled some holes. I love that using my jet drill press is so easy, any weirdo can do it. I had some 1/8 inch brass rod on hand, so I decided to use that for these pins. I tapped the rod into the hole using light taps so I didn't tweak the rod in the process. I tapped it until it was flush with the other side. And then I used my multi-tool with a metal cutting blade and I cut off the excess rod. The excess piece had some rough burrs on the end and it needed to be cleaned up a bit, so I took care of that over at the belt sander. And then with the ends all cleaned up, I just repeated these steps for each pinned corner. Moving on to the drawers, I needed to sand off that heavy, runny, drippy situation that was on there and take it down to the bare wood, which is a veneer by the way, so I had to be very careful not to burn through the veneer as I sanded it. Here you can see the progress. The original on the left side, and then the sanded off finish on the right. I was trying to be careful with that old veneer, and I think I did a pretty good job. Now I'm going to look at these vertical pieces. On the original, you can see they have a bit of a recess that the frame piece kind of fits right into. So to replicate this, I set up the dado blades again and remove material from the ends of the pieces first, since they can be cut using the same setup. Then I changed the distance of the fence and took care of the middle. Looking at the original piece again, you can see there's a lip along each of these pieces here. I'll call these the tracks that the drawers will slide on, and there's notches on the underside of the drawers that slide along these tracks. So I made these strips that I'm going to add to mine and replicate the tracks as well, like this. Great idea, terrible execution. You can see I mismeasured or forgot to measure or something, and the notches don't line up with my tracks. So I had to come up with a fix to remove some material from these inside edges. I gave it some thought and decided to try doing it on the CNC. Using the Carbide Crate software, I created a toolpath that would cut away just a little bit from the inside edges. I thought about tackling this at the router table, but I got a little freaked out thinking about what could go wrong. I also thought about making some sort of a jig or template and using my handheld router with the guide bushing, but I didn't really like my chances with that option either. So I looked at this as an opportunity to try using my CNC to fix a mistake that I made. So after the CNC had done its thing, I was able to take those strips and then I could glue those into place, and I would just hold them in place with some of those spring clamps. You know, as woodworkers, we always say, oh, you can never have too many clamps. And the spring clamps are definitely one of those clamps that you can just get a whole bunch of because they're cheap and they're easy to store. They don't take up a lot of space. And a lot of the time, those spring clamps are just what the doctor ordered. And while I waited for the glue to dry, I thought, hey, there's a top that needs to be sanded. let's get started on that. It didn't take long for the glue to dry, and as you can see, everything pretty much worked out like I wanted it to. And just like those drawers are sliding on those tracks, I'm gonna slide right into the next part of this project. With the parts all sanded and down to the bare wood, it was time for some new color. And the colors I'm using are Pecan and Provincial. I'm gonna be mixing these two colors because the Pecan by itself was too light and the Provincial by itself was too dark. So what do you do when one's too light and one's too dark? Well, you mix them. And I did 5 ounces of the Pecan and then followed up with 5 ounces of the Provincial and just mixed them up real good so that I could start applying them to my parts. You'll see I've got some holes drilled in these parts, and I'll explain what those are for in just a minute. Before I started staining everything, I labeled every point where there would be a connection. That way I knew that when I went to put it back together, all the proper parts would fit where they belong. And when I was staining, I tried to keep the stain off of the numbers. That way I'd still see them later, because since it's going to be all covered with other parts and glue and all that stuff, it's not going to matter whether there's stain on that little tiny spot or not. Jumping over to the original one more time for reference, I can see that there were some screws used on one side and then more of a nail used on the other side. In an attempt to keep this as close as I possibly could to the original, I figured I would do the same thing. However, I'm going to get a little fancy and I'm going to use brass screws and nails. And that's where those holes that I showed you earlier are going to come into play. So I grab all my stained parts and I'm making sure to match up those labeled pieces. And here you can see how these are going to go together. And there's that hole that I pre-drilled earlier. A little bit of glue, and then I can start putting in these screws. Since brass is a softer metal, I want to be careful not to damage the screw head when I'm driving it in with that Phillips screwdriver. So that's why I'm doing it by hand and not using a drill. To tackle the other side with the nails, however, I'm going to go about it a little differently. Just as with the screws, I don't want to damage these brass nail heads, but I also don't want to damage the wood, so I'm not going to be hammering these nails into place. Instead, I'm going to use one of my quick clamps and just kind of clamp it down, and that'll act like a press to push these nails down into place, and that way I don't get any hammer marks on the wood or scuff up the brass in the process. Now that these drawer frames are finally assembled, I really like the contrast between the brass screws and that stain color. I think it's pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
Moving back to the desktop panel, I checked out both sides and figured out which side I wanted to be the top, and then I went ahead and labeled it with a piece of tape. After that, I went ahead and squared up both ends of the desktop piece with my track saw. Next, I need to mill some more of that oak because I'm going to do breadboard ends on this desktop. If you're not familiar with what breadboard ends are, it's basically just an extra strip of wood that goes down on the ends of your workpiece. It's not only decorative, but it also helps to keep the shape of your desktop or your tabletop, and it helps prevent it from curving or bowing. And I'll explain it a little bit more in just a minute. I made this tall parts fence accessory specifically for this project, and it just simply slides over the existing table saw fence, and it gives me more vertical support, which is what I'm going to need when I go to cut these grooves in the ends of this desktop. But I'm going to start by cutting the grooves in the breadboard pieces that I just made. And I should note that I also labeled the top side of these parts, and that's the side that rides along the fence. So I'm going to be sure to run the labeled side of the desktop panel along this fence as well. Speaking of which, what do you say we do that right now? There's a lot of things that I haven't done before, and using this tall parts fence accessory is one of those things. But once you get that first time out of the way, it helps you to feel more confident in your skills, even if it's something as simple as running some grooves through some end grain. Once it's done, now you've got another trick up your sleeve that you can use on future projects. Off camera, I milled some 1/4 inch thick oak strips, and those are going to serve as the splines for these breadboard ends. I was fortunate in that they fit like a glove right on the first try. And you know, whenever you do this, after the dry fit, it's time to get out the glue and the clamps. So this guy Ken, who I'm doing this project for, he just loves unique and one-of-a-kind things, and I knew the minute I loaded this thing into my truck to bring home to the shop that I wanted to cut out that Singer logo and put his last name in there instead. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew I wanted to do it. So when I got to this point of the project, I just started cutting. And sometimes the only way to figure out a solution is to just throw yourself into the problem. So that's what I did. With the letters removed, I could start cleaning up the area, and to do that, I was using this carbide burr set that I got from my Dremel tool. This little set includes a few different shaped cutting heads, and that can be really helpful depending on the contour of your workpiece. And I was able to get my workpiece looking like this pretty quickly. And from there, I could do a little hand sanding to smooth it out a little bit more. While I had the base up on the work table, I figured now would be a good time to check out the wheels on this thing. And as you can see, the wheels, or what's left of the wheels, were in rough shape. So those definitely needed to come out. I used a combination of different tools to get that done, and also clean up all those little areas. After making note of a couple measurements, I found the appropriate sized hole saw and I loaded it up in the drill press. And then using some of the oak that I've been using on this project, I used the hole saw to create what'll be this table's new pair of shoes. Of course, wheels aren't typically squared off around the edges, so I took these things over to the router table and loaded a round over bit, and then just kind of nibbled away at it real carefully, because you can see the way I'm doing it is kind of sketchy, but I didn't really know of any other way to do this. But using those push blocks helped keep my fingers safe. Now I can drill some new holes, grab some bolts, and test fit these new wheels. And even though I still need to cut these bolts down to the proper length, this gives me a really good idea of what this is going to look like in the end. And I think I like how those oak wheels are going to look with that black metal base. With the wheels out of the way, I jump back to the oak top and trim off a little bit from one edge, and that allows me to trim off the excess from the breadboards. And now with the clean edge, I can trim off the excess from the other side over on the table saw. To mount the oak top to the base, I got to figure out where exactly I want it to sit on this base. So to do this, I just take some measurements, sort of trial and error, do a little shimmy back and forth if I need it, until I got the measurement the same on both sides. And then I can just use a pencil to mark where the holes are in the cast iron base. I'm going to be installing these threaded inserts where I just made my pencil marks. And I'll start by drilling my hole and using masking tape as a depth gauge on the drill bit. And then I'll follow up with a countersink bit and then drive in the threaded insert with a bit that's made specifically for doing just that. And while a nice squared off edge would be perfectly fine, I kind of felt like doing a little bit more of a profile, so I did that with a router bit over at my router table. And while I was putting the profile on those edges, I was still thinking in the back of my head about how I wanted to do those letters for that logo area. And with my deadline approaching, I just decided, let's just do something on the CNC. So let me show you how I did that and what I came up with. I opened up the Carbide Create software once again. I wanted to use a font that was similar to the Singer logo, and that way it would be appropriate for this machine and it would still look like it fit in there. I didn't want some wild font or something that was too simple or something that was too modern. What I ended up with was a font that had sort of a collegiate sort of a vibe to it, and I didn't want to leave the font as it was. I wanted to add like a little bit of dimension, a little bit of depth. So I created some inside and outside outlines on these letters, and I tweaked them around a little bit because just doing them as they landed, some corners and things weren't quite right. So I needed to go in and tweak the little keyframes of all these different curves and all that. But once I got it where I liked it, then I could run the simulation of the cutout and see how it's going to look on the material that I'm going to use, which will be a piece of alder I had. Seeing the preview this way gives me a really good idea of how the end is going to look, and that was really exciting. So once I got my settings kind of dialed in, got everything looking how I wanted it to look, I could generate that G-code file and send it to the machine. With a successful CNC cut behind me, I can pop out the letters from that tree with a few whacks on a chisel, and kind of reminds me of when I used to build model cars. With the model car parts, however, I could just slice off those tabs with an X-Acto knife, but when it comes to the woodworking part of things, I gotta take them over to the router table, and then I'll use the cutest little flush trim bit I've ever seen. And this particular bit is the Amana Mini Flush Trim bit, and it's perfect for these smaller parts. And I found it works really good on other things that might have a tighter inside radius. I'll have a link to this one down in the description, and make sure you pick one up. It's a really good bit to have in your collection. Look at those happy little letters. And the plan is to attach the letters in here, and you can see that this area has a bit of a beveled surface. So what I did was mount my belt sander in my vise, and I just nibbled away until I got the fit that I was happy with. And as I moved along, I put the letters in place with some tape, and that way I could determine the spacing between all the letters. And to adhere the letters in place, I used that steel reinforced epoxy from JB Weld. And I figured I'm gluing these letters to metal and there's metal in the epoxy, so why not? I globbed on a fair amount to these letters and set them in place. But don't worry, I cleaned up the squeeze out too. I just did that off camera. I also put some of the JB Weld on the back side of the letters for a little extra stay put security. And while that cures, I did a little woodworking off camera and made this small panel with some more of those threaded inserts. I apologize for not showing a little bit more of this glue up, but it's a really basic glue up, and as I mentioned before, my deadline was getting close and I just needed to start wrapping up some more of these parts so I could keep moving forward. So this panel is going to get mounted to the underside of the desktop, and that way I can add another cool little feature which you'll see in just a minute. Since I'll be using domino joinery to attach this piece, I needed to take some measurements and then make some marks, and then make some more marks, and then maybe erase a few marks, and then add a few more marks, and once I have all the marks I could possibly need, I can finally fire up the domino to cut out my mortises. Now I can load up some glue, insert the dominoes, put everything in place, and lock it all together with some clamps. At this point, I was getting really close to finishing this project. I also let my curiosity get the better of me, and I wanted to see if I could remove the bolts that were holding this whole base together. Assuming I could get them all out, I wanted to see if I could clean them up and clear out any of the rust or gunk that may have developed over the years. And this step was totally unnecessary, but I just like taking things apart and putting them back together, hopefully in better shape than they were before. And just like I thought, it was a lot of fun seeing what connected to what to make these parts move properly. Once I got all the bolts out, I cleaned up the threaded holes and the bolts themselves, and I actually ended up rethreading several of the holes and the bolts. If you want to know how much I care about my projects, just check out the battle wounds on those hands. With everything disassembled, I figured now is a good time to wipe everything down with some mineral spirits, and this will help to get any remaining dirt or dust or grime or oil or whatever might be on those things, get all that stuff off of there, and then I can give it a few coats of paint. I mentioned adding another cool little feature to this piece, and that feature is going to attach to the threaded inserts I installed earlier. Ken wanted me to install this little Fort Knox safe into the desktop, and the holes on the back side of the safe will be used to bolt it securely to that small panel. I also added a couple more holes to the top of the safe, and I'm going to install more threaded inserts so that I can run bolts into those, giving this little safe 6 connection points to this desktop. Good luck, thieves. And now I can bolt it in and make sure the holes and the inserts line up and everything fits right, and you can see how it'll hang when it's on the base. Everything looks good, and now it's on to the next step, which just happens to be staining. And I just used some more of my custom recipe stain that I used on the drawers earlier. And while the stain dries, I jump back to Carbide Create for one more CNC project. And this one is really easy, just a simple name, 4 letters, no big deal. And rather than using a regular end mill to engrave the name, I'm using a 90-degree V-bit. And the way I positioned it in the Carbide Create design was to accommodate the way I needed to position the oak desktop in the cutting area on the actual Shapeoko machine. Right off the bat, this oak desktop is a little bit too big to fit on the Shapeoko, but I already knew that was going to be the case. I was just planning on sliding the desktop into the Shapeoko the long ways with like 2/3 of it hanging over the front, and then I could easily secure it down with some hold down clamps. What I didn't anticipate was now that I had attached the rear panel for the safe, I couldn't slide the desktop into the Shapeoko as far as I needed to in order to engrave that name on there. I ended up using some sandbags and some blocks of wood to prop up the overhanging end of the desktop. And the majority of CNC projects are cut within the surface area of the wasteboard, but given my predicament, I wondered if I could cut further forward on the Y-axis because the spindle can actually travel past the front of the machine a little bit. So I took my chances, and as it turns out, the answer is yes. And that little bit extra was just what I needed to engrave this name. You can see from this overhead shot that the normal work area of the CNC machine ends right about here, but with the extra motion on the Y-axis, I was able to get maybe a couple extra inches in there, so not too shabby. And with that last bit of stress out of the way, I can move on to clear coating everything with some General Finishes Armor Seal. This has been one of my favorite finishes over the years, and I've used it on a lot of different kinds of projects, especially projects that are going to get a lot of use. It looks great and it's durable and it's easy to clean, so if you've never used it, you should definitely give it a try. And of course, I'll have a link down in the description so that you can get some for yourself. I did a couple coats of this and I lightly sanded in between, and once that was dry, I could finally put everything back together. Well, my friends, this project has come to an end, and it was a lot of fun to take it apart and see how all of the parts function and work together. And it was just as much fun to make all the new parts and put it all back together again. If I had to pick a favorite part of this project, it's obviously got to be the custom name piece down here, and that CNC machine is the perfect tool to help me get that done. I know there's a lot of Singer sewing machine tables out there in the world, but it's pretty safe to say that this is a one-of-a-kind, unique piece, and there's not another one just like this one in the whole world. I like that a lot, and Ken, I know you gotta love that, man. So I hope you and your family enjoy this thing for a really long time, and to everybody watching the video, I hope you liked seeing how the whole thing came together and kind of how I problem solved some things and how I put the whole project together. I'll have links down in the description to some of the tools that I used to help me get this project done. So hit that like button. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you're not already a subscriber to the channel, I would love to have you. And you can also follow me over on Instagram. So until next time, you guys, I'll see you later. Keep making stuff.